pill testing. By now I'm sure all of you are familiar with the spate of deaths that we've had in the last 2 years or so. The most recent one was in July. Kids are out there, they're doing drugs are bad, and often they either overdose or they consume a pill that is contaminated with some extra agent, and that often leads to them dying. Now, this has led to two different approaches. One side argues that we have to minimize harm, that even though doing drugs is illegal and is not advisable, at least we can save people's lives, and allowing people to test these pills to find out some information that informs their choices, even though those choices are illegal, is a good way of approaching the problem and hopefully doing less damage. This is the approach that's been taken in countries like the Netherlands, Portugal, and so on. By contrast, in Australia, we've taken a different approach. You go to any festival today and you'll see more people in police officer uniforms than you will in Reveller outfits. And often the ones in Reveller outfits are plainclothes policemen. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, obviously I'm the moderator. I don't have any opinion on the topic. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't even know why people would do drugs, right? I mean, why would you spend $35 on a pill? We can go to a festival, spend $150 on mid-strength beer, and be half sober the whole day. I don't understand why anyone would do that. But anyway, you didn't come here to listen to me. You came here to listen to two people who are far more eminently qualified on this than I am. So our first speaker today, he is going to be making the case for why pill testing should be legalized. He is a highly accomplished, he's a renowned drug policy expert and the co-founder of Harm Reduction Australia. His name is Gino Vambuka.
Thank you for that introduction. What I should do is just explain a bit about myself as well. Thank you for the opportunity as well to talk today. I'm president and co-founder of Harm Reduction Australia, which is actually the organisation that runs pill testing services. So the two trials that have occurred at Canberra's Grooving the Moo Festival in April this year and April before, we ran the pilot program of pill testing in the festival itself. So I'm speaking as someone who not only knows the evidence and a lot of the research and academic work behind pill testing, but also in terms of delivering that service directly to patrons. Before I do that though, before I go into some of the reasons why we actually ran pill testing, I think it's important to understand where we come from as an organisation, and personally where I come from as to why we would do this. About 35 years ago, I graduated from Sydney Uni, and my first job was at St Vincent's Hospital in Darlinghurst as a social worker and counsellor. When I started there, it was around the same time that HIV/AIDS became diagnosed in the US and was starting to be seen as being transmitted between injecting drug users. So obviously in Darlinghurst, King's Cross was the epicentre of injecting drug use in Sydney. So my boss at the time, the director, Dr. Wodak at the Drug and Alcohol Service there, asked people who was happy to be in an act of civil disobedience start the first needle exchange program in Sydney. So Alex, myself and another person there, Kate, we decided that because of what we were seeing with HIV and the harm that was causing, and in those days you've got to remember there was very difficult to diagnose and impossible to treat at that time. So people were on about a 9 to 12 month diagnosis or infection to death. So we had to act fairly quickly, and we decided that to reduce the harm we would introduce needle and syringe program, a pilot program, which we did. It was illegal at the time, but eventually became a program that was accepted and now in any state in Australia and most countries around the world, especially in Southeast Asia now and Europe, you can actually go to a needle and syringe program if you're an injector to get clean injecting equipment and get a lot of advice and information about HIV transmission. And the reason I raise that is because a lot of the arguments we had then are what we have now about pill testing. So when we talk about pill testing, we're talking about setting up, sometimes the last one was in a hall like this where we had a cordoned off area and we had a pill testing machine, a spectrometer, infrared spectrometer operating, and people from the festival would be able to come in and talk to us, provide a sample to get that, whatever they were considering consuming, actually analysed to understand what it was they were actually going to consume. But some of the arguments against us being there, it took a lot of negotiation with the ACT government to allow us to do it, and with the festival promoters as well, and the ACT police, who are covered by the federal police, to allow us to do it, because you'll send the wrong message. It'll send the wrong message is what people have said to us, that what we're saying to people, it's okay to use drugs. Now, answer to that, this is what we encounter with needle and syringe programs, what we encounter with methadone programs. Often when we try and introduce a harm reduction program, we come up against this thing saying you're sending the wrong message. You're telling people it's okay to use a drug. What we find is that when you talk to people about consuming drugs, about using drugs, whatever it may be, when they have more information, they actually make better decisions about what to do. In the pill testing, some of the things we found is that some people will discard when they find out what it is that actually they're going to consume, they'll discard the pill. And that's because in a lot of cases it's not what they thought it was. Virtually everyone who comes to see us in the pill testing tent, when we ask them, what do you think you bought? They'll say MDMA. They'll say they bought ecstasy or MDMA. Last year we did the trial, more than half didn't have any ecstasy or MDMA. It was a mix of more than likely methamphetamines, ketamine, a whole range of other substances were in there. And when people find that out, I think like, I actually don't want to take that. And just going back to the point you made, people pay $150, $200 for a ticket, and we're saying to them, you're going to take something that may well cause an adverse reaction, you may end up in the back of an ambulance, you may have to seek medical assistance if you take it. That's not what they bought it for. They bought it for reasons to enhance their experience at the festival, whether you agree or not. That's why they wanted to consume that drug. So people will discard. In other cases, they'll moderate what they consume, meaning that if we say this is a fairly high purity drug, or it's a particular drug that can cause these effects, they'll take half, a quarter, but they'll moderate how much they use. So again, that's a win for us in terms of reducing the potential for harm if people moderate their drug use. It's not all about stop using drugs. We're just giving people information to make a decision about what is best for them. And I'm sure if you went to any economics class here, you would find out that the better informed the market is, then the better decisions are made. And so what this does is it actually puts pressure back on the dealers and producers of drugs about people are understanding what it is they're buying. And that actually reduces the likelihood of harm from drugs because you can't get away with selling bad drugs. And the reason we know that is that not everyone discarded the pills when they found out it wasn't something they wanted. And when we asked them, said, you can dispose of it here in the amnesty, and they said, no, I'm taking it back. They're going to go and confront the guy they bought it from or the girl they bought it from and say, I've just had this analysed and what you actually sold me was ketamine or methamphetamine, not ecstasy. And the reason people always try and sell you ecstasy is you get a higher price. If I have a tablet of ecstasy, I can get a lot more for that than I can if I try and sell you methamphetamine or ketamine or some other mix of drugs. So everyone gets told it's ecstasy, but it's rare, is what we're finding. It's actually, the last trial we did was a lot more ecstasy actually available than was the year before. So the market is changing. But the point I'm making is that an informed consumer market actually is much better for decision making. It's not sending the wrong message, it's actually telling people a lot more about what they're going to do. And for a lot of people they're what we would call in the public health sphere is naive users. These are people who, particularly one in Canberra where it's associated with the local universities, people who only would use that drug at the festival or at certain times and don't actually know a lot about the drugs they're consuming. And so they've never really talked to anybody about what it is they're consuming and what the effects may be and what the harms may be. And so if they walk in, they will speak to one of the chemists from the Australian National University and his team. They'll speak to our medical team that's run by emergency doctors. They'll speak to our brief intervention team, which is run by peer counsellors, drug and alcohol professionals and public health professionals. And then they walk out after 15, 20 minutes of getting all of this, as well as the results of what it is they're going to take. For some of them, and I know because they talk to me afterwards, they'll say, I had no idea what the hell I was doing until I walked in. They had no idea what they were going to consume, what the potential impacts were, and even by having medical people there, what they're able to do is they actually say to them, I'm actually on these other tablets, or I'm an epileptic, or I have this other condition, and our medical staff there can actually provide them with some further information about what the interactions may be with what they're actually taking, and if they have other issues, what that may do if they consume that drug. And so that again allows them to make a decision. The other problem we run into, or issue we run into, is people say, if you're testing a drug that's illegal and someone then decides to take that drug, and then overdoses or there's some adverse reaction and, you know, in the worst case scenario they die, are we not liable then for the harm that's created? And the answer to that is simply no. We're not liable because we have very strict protocols about what people are told when they come in, and we never tell people it's safe to use a drug. We even had this incident where we had one of the pills tested was lactose. The person thought they bought ecstasy and it was just a lactose pill. So we even joked with the guy and he said, so it's okay to take? And we said, not if you're lactose intolerant. It's not, no. You'll have an adverse reaction. So under no circumstances will we tell someone it's safe to take a drug. And if you think about it, and we have fairly strong legal advice on this as well, if we tell someone you're taking a drug that can cause harm, we're telling you all the problems you may encounter if you take that drug, and then you choose to consume that drug. If we were then liable for any adverse outcome by you choosing to take that drug, it would just undermine the whole public health system. It would undermine the whole medical system in a way, because if you go to see your doctor and he says you shouldn't smoke, you shouldn't drink, and then you continue to smoke and drink and you have problems, say, well, I told him but I still did it. He can't force you, or she can't force you to stop. In the end you make your own decision, and the whole rationale of public health is informing people and providing them with options and opportunities to improve their health, but we can't make it compulsory for people any more than I can stop you going to eat, you know, a plate full of fried food every hour if you want. It's not good for you. You have the opportunity to make that decision whether it's good for you or not. And so again, that often our critics will say, you know, you're opening up all this liability. We're not, and we're very clear about it. And the other reason I know we're not is we have insurance. I can tell you now that if an insurance company actually thought that by running our service we were liable for potential deaths and overdoses and adverse outcomes, they wouldn't be insuring us. They wouldn't allow us to operate in terms with insurance. But we do. We have companies that are prepared to insure us because they read our protocols, they see how we operate, and they understand that what we're doing is a public health service, like a lot of other public health services. So the other issue I wanted to raise was about how we operate, that we can't give the best information to people. People often accuse us our equipment doesn't provide you with exact purity levels or dosage levels of what you're taking. And that's true. We don't actually claim that we are giving people that information. And there's, for us, a valid reason why that happens. Imagine we are setting up here in a festival and we're running a pill testing service, and we're running all day and all night to early hours of the morning. The temperature's going to drop, the humidity will change. The conditions which we're operating the machinery, which is laboratory grade machinery and equipment, needs to be robust enough to operate outdoors. Now there's a limit to what you can do. The machine we use, the spectrometer, does operate outdoors and is robust enough to handle it. It costs around $50,000, but the best equipment would probably cost around $100,000 to $200,000. However, when we tried to use it, we actually had a company that flew all the way from the US, Seattle, came out with 2 technicians, flew that gas spectrometer out to actually operate in April in Canberra. Obviously they hadn't done their research on the temperature in Canberra, and it didn't operate. Under the conditions it couldn't operate outdoors because it was too sensitive to what was the temperature and humidity around it and basically the cold. So we're limited by what we can offer in a festival ground because it actually is in the open air realistically. But what we provide, as I said, costs $50,000. We provide a hell of a lot more information than you'll get from a $10 or $20 reagent test kit, which is your only other option at the moment. You can go into one of the off your trees, and there's a few stores that offer those reagent test kits. We're using like litmus paper and putting drops on it and trying to read what's in there for about $20. That's a fairly crude measure of what you're going to get. Ours is a lot more sophisticated than that. And again, we operate on the principle that we won't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So what we offer is a lot better and is good, but it's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot more information than people will get than if they use just a reagent test kit or just taking the advice of the person they bought the drug off. Just to finish off, I think the other point we raise is that because a lot of toxicologists actually focus on the equipment used and try and denigrate what we do, saying that there's better equipment, you're not using the best equipment, and as I said, we agree. But they also miss the point of what we actually operate is a holistic service. So people are coming in The reason they may be coming in is to get their drugs analysed, but they get to talk, and they will, and they often want to talk then to the chemist, the doctor, the counsellor. They get a lot more information. It's that interaction with people that's important. The analysis is only an adjunct to what we actually provide. The main service we provide is a public health information education service. And just to finish, you've got to remember, we're operating in festival grounds where people have come through. In New South Wales, if we'd operate, they would have gone past sniffer dogs, past police, through security. They're standing in there in the festival environment. They're about to use that drug, and what we're saying is, just pause, come and talk to us before you do that. If we weren't there, they're going to use it. They've made the decision to use that drug. And to say that we're somehow encouraging drug use or facilitating drug use is wrong, because if you run all those gauntlets and you're standing there at 11 p.m. or 2 a.m. in the morning, you've decided to take that drug. So we're the last line of information defence about harm that may happen to that person who takes that drug. So that's why we advocate for pill testing. That's why we put our own money behind it and run the pill testing services, and we offer it free to every state and territory government as well to do it. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for that, Gino. So our next speaker, who is going to be arguing against pill testing, he's a former politician, he's a cop and a priest. Please welcome Chris Yates.
Thank you. I mean, there's one thing I think I can definitely agree with you on straight away, which is I was a policeman in rural Oxfordshire first and then in London, and so I policed illegal raves that were set up in farmers' fields and Reading Festival and everything in between, and I know exactly why people would rather be out of their minds than actually aware of their surroundings. They're pretty dire places. They're fairly dull. They're not really nice places to be, but there you go. In researching this, I did manage to find a joke that is barely sort of relevant to me, which is, I know what you're thinking. If God dropped acid, would he see people? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Macquarie University Liberal Club for inviting me to debate today. I'm a very keen believer in debate. In order for us to develop as human beings and to truly think through an issue, it's important that multiple sides of a subject can be explored and thought aired. I also acknowledge the support of Macquarie University and the support they've shown the Liberal Club to hold oftentimes, I'm told, controversial debates. And whilst today's debate is unlikely to agitate listeners to the point of violence, I would reiterate that we should all fundamentally believe that free speech and free expression are the cornerstone of civilised discourse and indeed civilised culture. I'll also let you know that I was a riot policeman in the UK for 10 years, so if you want to get violent, I've given you fair warning. I've also, in preparing for today, been at pains to remind myself that this is not a sermon. Although I do wish to persuade you of the arguments against pill testing, I'm more concerned to lay out the arguments and to let you decide. I know that this topic can cut close to the bone for those who have lost loved ones to drugs. I myself had an older sister murdered by a drug-addicted man, so I do hope that you see that my motivation is formed by genuine concern for the well-being of people, rather than as a self-righteous clergyman trying to nanny you. Believe it or not, although I'm an ex-policeman and a priest, I did in fact work for Senator David Lionel. And I'm his vision. When he has nightmares, he imagines a priest with a cop's badge. So it tells you something about his willingness to take risks, I think. Before I get into the specific issues related to pill testing, I'd like to step back and discuss the nature of drugs and controlled drugs in particular. And it's always important to know what the context is. The first thing to say is actually there is nothing inherently wrong or evil about drugs. From a philosophical point of view, and that's my area of expertise if anyone wants to discuss that later, but from a philosophical point of view, no inanimate substance could ever be considered evil. Substances are neutral. Indeed, only humans have the capacity and the ability to act in evil ways, because evil requires moral complicity from a moral actor. Human beings are unique in the universe, as far as we know, in having what St. Thomas Aquinas would call a rational soul. We can choose what to do, and we can choose what not to do. And we can't blame anybody else for that unless we are compelled by another person. For example, alcohol cannot be found guilty of assaulting a person, but a person intoxicated by alcohol can. If their intoxication is voluntary, then it is no defence under moral law, or indeed under the criminal law, to say that it wasn't my fault. Now, humans have been using and developing substances from the natural world for multiple uses, such as analgesics, treatments of illness and injury, spiritual rituals, and yes, for pleasure and recreational use for as long as we have existed. I myself am a keen drug user. I use alcohol when I celebrate the Holy Eucharist, as well as to enhance meals and to relax me at the end of a long day. I occasionally use ibuprofen the following morning if I have relaxed too much. And my drug of choice, caffeine, enables me to face the challenges of the day ahead without resorting to murderous rage. In fact, a parishioner once bought me a coffee mug on which it was written, "I hate morning people." A particular flaw perhaps for someone like me who often meets people in the morning. The drugs I've mentioned are readily available and open to be used and abused by each of us according to our desires. Indeed, all of them could be taken to such an excess as to cause serious health issues, even death. They are also highly regulated and controlled because they are legal. As a result of this, we know exactly how much alcohol is in our gin and tonic. If anyone's going to the bar, that's what I like to drink. Exactly how much ibuprofen is in a tablet. And these are both accompanied by medical advice on acceptable doses. It is a relatively modern phenomenon that certain drugs have been prohibited by law. We can all read of the opiate use prevalent in the Victorian era in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes books. And there are countless other references to what are now illegal drugs in film, television and literature from the very recent past. Drug use didn't always carry a stigma. My own grandmother can remember the local chemist selling amphetamines over the counter. She didn't tell me whether she bought any. And she's 92 years old now and very much alive. But at a certain point in the development of culture, one that coincided with both wider availability and increasing population and a greater knowledge of the biological and psychological effects of certain drugs on the human body, our lawmakers drafted laws that restricted and control the supply, manufacture and availability of what we now call illegal drugs. There are those today who would wish to move the dealing of these drugs away from the criminal realm and into that of healthcare. This is what lies behind the pill testing movement. But in fact, these drugs began in the realm of healthcare, available at the chemist, and this led to such destructive effects on people and communities that they were moved to the criminal code. And one reflection on this was made by the famous philosopher Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, who said, "I've never had a problem with drugs, I've had a problem with the police." The testers will be effectively working for the dealers that makes a fortune from the misery and risk-taking of their clients are very much in favour of pill testing sites. They may even use them to bump up their prices or to persuade users to test them out if you don't believe me. And who are these testers? Are they privately employed or a government department? Who is underwriting their insurance? Is the taxpayer going to be picking up the tab for illegal drug users to be safer? What I do know is that Pill Testing Australia is largely funded by charitable organisations that receive funding from government departments. As the governments of Australia have no money of their own, that means taxpayers. Why should taxpayers subsidise testing of illegal drugs that cause nothing but an increase in costs to healthcare and criminal activity, again at their own expense? If the argument from Gino was that the drug users pay for this service, then we might be having a different discussion. But it is unlikely that drug users would use this facility if they were the ones who had to pay for them. Being in possession of an illegal drug is a crime unless one is exempted from the Act for the purposes of law enforcement, or a licensed forensic examiner, or for the purposes of disposal. What is the legal position of these testers? It was never envisaged that exceptions would be made to aid illegal use, but rather to apprehend offenders. How will these people be regulated? How can we be assured that they don't take the drugs for themselves? Not that I'm suggesting you do, Gino. Where are the checks and balances that drugs disposed of get destroyed? How binding would a signed waiver be if a young adult died having gone through a pill testing area and taken it anyway? We can already see the headlines of parents wanting answers and compensation. Who would pick up this tab? What criminal or civil liabilities will be faced by testers in these situations? So far I've set out how pill testing works and asked some serious questions that need to be considered if any such policy was to be adopted. The tragic stories of parents mourning the loss of their young adult children move us all. But the truth is that these fatalities are always caused by the desired drug, MDMA or ecstasy in general. And some take as many as 9 pills. And that was their decision, it was their life, it was their bad choice. Pill testing would simply have confirmed to these misguided souls that what they were taking was what they wanted to take in the first place. They and their families paid the ultimate price. There is no safe dose, yet Australians are among the leading consumers of ecstasy in the world. I'm being reminded that my time's running out. So I'll come to some of this in the rebuttal. Drugs were made illegal for reasons based on the observation of the effects on individual and public health. They are a scourge that have had a devastating effect on lives and cost the taxpayer a fortune in related problems. No amount of ecstasy can be considered safe. Pill testing gives a false impression of safety and regulation, when in fact we are dealing with the product of unscrupulous, callous and exploitative drug dealers. I oppose pill testing.
Cool, thanks for that. All right, so now each speaker will have a 5-minute rebuttal. I think Gino had about 30 seconds roughly more time, so I'll give Chris an extra 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
Thank you. The first point I'll make is if you study the history of drug use, those decisions about what's illegal and legal drug use are not based on people's observations about harms. That's not what they're based on. They're based on political decisions that you can trace back to the Nixon administration in particular, and about the decisions they made about politics and what would sell and what would work in their country at that time. And that's what we've been following, and most countries have been following through the UN Charter system, and have been fooled into thinking that somehow that was based on some health decision or decision based on the harm of actual drugs. It's not. So I think we need to be clear about why some drugs are illegal and why some are others. The other point I'll make is if we're going to talk about money in taxpayer funds, that's fine. Pill Test Australia doesn't actually receive taxpayer funds. It's actually private and personal donations, probably 80-90% of the money we get. Some organisations who are funded by governments have provided some money, $500 here, $1,000 there. But as I said, the machine has cost us $50,000, and we run 2 pilots based on voluntary staff, voluntary labour, and everyone covering their own costs to do that as a private individual. So I will admit that if we go to a much broader system, then it will require funding. However, if we're going to use that as the benchmark of what we fund in public health, then you must be arguing as well, Chris, that people who smoke should be refused entry into public hospitals because they know full well what the damage they're doing to themselves are by smoking. People who drink should be refused entry into public hospitals or for any treatment because they know full well what the damage they're doing is. People who are obese should be refused. People who are diabetic who don't actually adjust their diet. Where are you going to draw the line? Or is it only simply because it's drug users that we can draw the line and say everybody can get health except you guys? You get a lesser standard because you use drugs. And as you said, they're people's sons and daughters and the likes. And one of our biggest supporters are families. And I talk regularly to a couple of the parents who have lost their kids recently in the festivals. They are strong supporters of what we do because they don't want to see that happen to another kid. They don't want to see that grief fall upon another family. And that's who actually provides us with a lot of impetus and a lot of drive and a lot of motivation to actually get pill testing in. And again, I'm not going to argue that what we offer is a perfect service and we provide the best available information. I will question Andrew Levy because you did qualify him as a forensic toxicologist. He's not. I just want to be clear, he's not. He's a marketing person. His PhD is in marketing. He's not actually a qualified toxicologist. We're actually working with the Australian Association of Forensic Toxicologists, and they're helping us with actually developing better systems and a better database. The more testing we do, the better the information we can provide, because we can reference it to other results that we have. And when you raise the issue of an unknown drug, occasionally we did get an unknown drug, but we use a library, international library, of around 35,000 substances. So what we tell people, if we test something that doesn't come up with any match in that international library, what we're saying is we do have an unknown, and be very careful, because this has not been tested anywhere we know of in the world. Has anyone come up with this particular chemical structure that's in this pill? And what we know from the UN is that what is being created every year, you're seeing about 300 to 400 new chemical structured drugs, illicit drugs being created to subvert the legal, the laws of the land about what's legal and illegal to use. So what they do is they come up with different chemical structures, and they say that's not within the legislation, it can't be illegal because it's not covered in there, it's a new drug. So that's why we need to build that database, because that's the reality of what our drug laws internationally and nationally are doing. They're creating a whole perverse market of these new chemicals that are being produced and sold out there for people, and being marketed as ecstasy-like or amphetamine-like, and synthetic cannabinoids being another example. So I've got about 30 seconds left. I'm trying to think what else I can rebut. I think I'll probably leave it there, because as I said, we're not claiming to give the perfect information, but just on the liability issue, we do have fairly strong legal advice about what we do and the protocols we have in place. We don't actually want to see a death. We don't actually want to run that argument. If someone loses their child, that would be horrible for us to actually have to argue against parents. That's not what we want to do, but we're going into this to actually reduce the likelihood of that happening. That's what we're seeking to do. That's what the evidence tells us happens from over 20 years of pill testing in Europe. That's what we can do, and so that's what we're going to continue to try and do. And the longer we do it, the better we'll get at it.
Just to rebut immediately those first few things that were mentioned, because that's my job. Yes, tobacco and alcohol, obesity cause far more deaths, in fact, than illegal drug use. They all have associated taxes, and every single study, and again, having worked for David Lionhelm, was very, very pro-tobacco. I don't smoke myself. I thought I might, come out of the office smelling like tobacco every day, but it didn't happen. We know that tobacco users in this country more than pay for their healthcare. In fact, they're paying for my healthcare too, and I'm very grateful. Any smokers in the room, thank you. Thank you for paying for my doctor and my nurse. And the same is true of alcohol. Alcohol carries far less tax in England than it does here. I'm going there on Friday, and I'm going to enjoy drinking far cheaper beer as a result. So, and obesity, well, last time I checked we had GST on those generally the items that cause obesity, not fresh food and fruit and vegetables, but those naughty things that we all like to eat. So I just don't think that that's an argument. If it was legal and taxed, and we might be inclined to agree on that, I think, Gino, then that might be a different point of view. Comparing it to HIV, again, it's not an equivalence here. HIV is not illegal, neither is consensual sex, and the equivalent, to make it equivalent, would be to have an HIV tester at the bedroom door. That would be the equivalence to this pill testing situation, so I don't accept that that's the same thing. I'm also very worried that people may go back with their pills to the dealer they bought it from and demand their money back, because confronting drug dealers is seldom a productive experience unless you are a policeman with a big stick to hit them with. So I think that could cause more harm than good. And also this, I don't doubt that these are very well qualified teams of people, and probably better qualified than your detractors. I don't doubt that at all. Tends to be the way. People with qualifications actually do things. So I'm not disputing that, but that rather supports my argument that there's an implied safety to this as well. And we know that the truth is that it's MDMA that kills people at these festivals. It's because people drink too much water. It's because they get heat shock. That's what's killing them. It's not if there's a bit of mercury in the tablet. And the test, to reiterate, only tests one bit of the pill they're going to take, not the entire pill, and we have no idea what the 95% left has in it. You can't know that. You can guess, you can suppose, but you can't know. To reiterate, I just don't buy this nonsense that young drug users, or any drug users today, don't know what it is they're doing. It's saturated our media for 2 generations at least. In fact, 3. And we have, of course, Dr. Google, which is notoriously unreliable, but nevertheless a source of advice, and no doubt they could look up, and as I did, the pill testing Australia and see what they have to say for you. And you've mentioned the machine limitations. This is actually a serious issue. There is a development of synthetic drugs, and nothing's going to pick those up. And people buy synthetic drugs knowing they're synthetic in general. That's why they buy them, because they can't be prosecuted for it, because it's hard for legislation to keep up with invention. I don't accept that this list of prohibited drugs is arbitrary. They would never have been made illegal if it wasn't the desire of the people who vote for parties, who form government, that form policy. It's not a perfect system, but we can't argue that Richard Nixon arbitrarily dreamt up a list of drugs and that every country in the world immediately put them into legislation. I just don't think that's true. Well, I found there were 10 deaths in 5 years from this, by the way. That was my research, and even though 1 death is tragic, that's not a lot. There's far more people that are killed in other circumstances. The difference is, between alcohol abuse and all the rest of it, is that nobody ever died from drinking 1 beer. You're actually more likely to get bitten by a shark than die of taking an illegal drug, statistically. But very few people get bitten by a shark the first time they go for a swim in the ocean. The bottom line is that 1 in 2,000 first-time users of ecstasy risk death simply because their bodies can't tolerate it. There is no safe way to take drugs, and pill testing, if anything, makes it worse.
Thanks for that. Can I just say, how good is it to have a priest who just said, legalize, regulate, and tax drugs? That's just great. That's my kind of priest right there.
Yeah.
All right, so before I throw it to the audience, I thought I'd ask a few, 1 or 2 preliminary questions. So obviously a lot of this debate has centered around what the supposed effects might be if we legalize this. What would they look like? Would it lead to people confronting drug dealers? Would it lead to, the pill testing service getting sued? So I'd like to hear some comments, firstly, about what has been the experience in other countries that have been doing this for 20 years. And the second thing is, and I especially want to hear your comments on this, Chris. So you accept the fact that if we legalize, tax, and regulate it, that would reduce harm and produce better quality products? You touched on that. I've read that in the Netherlands, from the drugs that they've seized, because it's still illegal, from these festivals, about 13% is the rate at which they're caught with some toxic impurity. In Australian festivals, it's about 62%. So clearly there is this tendency to make the product safer. It's not as good as legalized, tax, and regulating it, but I do want to hear your comment on whether this is perhaps a stepping stone to that, and this could be the start of that ultimately beneficial, potentially, process. But yeah, I'd like to hear comments from both of you. First, with you, Gina.
It may well be a stepping stone. That's not our goal, is for legalisation and regulation, but one of our goals in drug policy is about regulation and decriminalisation of drugs. That's true. I will say that what we're talking about is festival pill testing at the moment, but we actually, and in the Netherlands in particular, they offer off-site testing, fixed site testing. So rather than just have it available at festivals, you can actually set up, as they have in the Netherlands, proper testing facilities that you can use a lot more sophisticated equipment in those facilities where people can get their drugs tested at any time. And we're looking to do that at the moment, probably establish a pilot program, won't say where, but we're in the midst of discussions and negotiations. Because if it's reasonable for someone to test a pill at a festival, it's reasonable for them to test a pill whenever they're going to use one. And ideally that's what we'd like people to do, is to have that test. So in terms of what would it lead to, the other thing to remember is when we talk about drug dealers, just most people don't buy their drugs from the Comancheros or from some triad group. That's not where they buy their drugs. Where they buy their drugs is from someone they know. It'll be a sibling, it'll be a cousin, it'll be a friend of someone they know at uni who's a friend and whatever. That's who they generally buy most of their drugs off for the people at festivals. They're not going into some bikie gang and buying their drugs from there. They're not confronting, as I say, Comancheros and the like to actually buy the drugs. So what we have is this huge network that happens because it's illegal, where drugs are sold through acquaintances and the like and work their way down to the people. And what happens as a result is what you see, the police response to this often is that of the 120,000 arrests in the last financial year in Australia, over 80% were for people possessing and using drugs, not for people dealing or trafficking. The majority of people are arrested for possessing and using drugs. That's where the focus of our dollars go. So you can talk about GST, alcohol tax and cigarette taxes, that's true. But what we do is the opposite. We actually spend a lot of public money punishing people for consuming a drug. That's where the majority of our money goes, and a hell of a lot more drug money goes into that than into the health and welfare for people who actually use drugs.
Just to come back here on that, it's very hard to differentiate in healthcare what's going towards any particular issue because these things are a plurality of things. I mean, if you're under the influence of drugs and you fall over and bang your head, well, you're treated for a head injury. But, you know, so, and that's a very obvious example, but it's very hard to draw a distinction between those things. In terms of what it costs to enforce drug laws, yes, it's an expense. And I'm no particular defender of the war on drugs, which somebody put that on Facebook, a good friend of mine, but the war on drugs has been so successful. And I didn't put anything in reply because I didn't want to give away any of my arguments. But actually, we've not had a war on drugs here. That's an American thing. You know, and the problem is that we don't differentiate between America and Britain and Australia, and we have different problems in different places. The difference is when taxpayers are demanded to pay for the enforcement of drugs, the difference is that voters have elected governments who have enacted laws that therefore necessarily have to be enforced. So there's a greater consent, not talking about individual people who can dissent to anything, but there's an overall consent. That's how politics works, that's how government works. There's a consent of the people to expect to have to pay for the enforcement of the laws that have gone through Parliament. And so my argument would be, from a political point of view, get yourself a political party together, form yourself some policies, see if people will elect you, see if they'll elect you in sufficient numbers to form a government, put that legislation before the Parliament and get it voted on. Trying to do it by the back door, by creating exceptions, by giving an impression that somehow this is official, is a bad idea and will lead to greater harm. And I've forgotten what your original question was, because I do want to address it. On regulation.
So it could be a gateway to getting it legalised tax-free.
Sure. I mean, so again, the argument is, if people want to have drugs legalised, and as I've said, I've got some sympathy with that perspective, they'd have to be taxed to high heaven, which might not undermine the illegal trade. Also, by the way, yes, you buy it from your mate at university, but where do they get the drugs from? You know, ultimately, drugs in any quantity that come into the country are involved in international organised crime. One of the major reasons I wouldn't do illegal drugs is because I don't want to put a dime in their pocket. Simple as that. Not one penny do I want to give to those despicable human beings who live off the misery of other people. So, again, I just want to reiterate, at the moment it's a free choice. I don't believe there's a single person in this country that takes an ecstasy tablet that doesn't know there's a health consequence to that. And if they take that choice, they take that risk, that's up to them. If we want to reverse drug legislation, people should form parties, see if people will vote for it, and my inkling would be, much as I might sympathise with it, most people in Australia wouldn't.
Look, he raised a very good point as well about how you've admitted that the pill testing is not perfect. You've admitted that you can't fix everything. Now, it's very obvious that one of the things you anyway cannot correct for is an individual's constitution. And we know for a fact that even a small amount of this drug can kill a person whose constitution is geared a certain way, which perhaps distinguishes it in some ways from other drugs which are legal. And also he mentioned that only 5% of the drug actually gets tested. Now that to me seems, that's a very small bit of the drug. God knows what's in the 95%. So that's scary. So I'd like to hear you respond to that. I'd also like to hear you respond to his point that ultimately, look, as long as this is illegal and we then pill test, obviously it is to some degree making the drug safer to use, and that is benefiting criminal syndicates who fund other illegal enterprises, including human trafficking and terrorism. So I'd like to hear you respond to that as well.
All right, on the 95% versus 5%, it's probably not even 5%, but when people are making pills and capsules, even though we're not going to say you can, unless you test the whole pill, then you know exactly what the whole contents is, because it doesn't go through some industrial process where you actually have all those checks and balances in there to know that it's a homogeneous substance that's being produced. We still know when they make the drugs and they use the pill presses and the like, that what they're producing in a batch tends to be fairly homogeneous. And we're also careful to advise people that what we're testing is a sample. We're always honest with people. That's one of the differences with our service to what the information you get from governments and the like, is that we're honest with people. We explain to them what we know and what we don't know. We don't tell them that drugs are bad or drugs are good, because when you start saying things like, yeah, drugs are bad for you, and then people go and get stoned and think, oh, that was great. Well, what do you think? You think they're going to listen to your information now about what drugs are like for them? Of course not. And of course there are inherent dangers in drug use with ecstasy. So if it was my kid going, or your kid, or someone new going to a festival, and they're about to consume that drug, regardless of whether they've been to Dr. Google, talked to someone else, seen some government education, who do you want them to talk to before they actually put that pill in their mouth? Do you want them to talk to our team, or the person they bought the drug off as the last person to actually find out what it is, or a Dr. Google, or whatever they may have read in a pamphlet somewhere? Who do you want them to talk to? And that's why families support us, because they want their kids to talk to us first. Because there is nothing like that human interaction with someone standing in front of a doctor or a chemist or a professional public health worker, explaining to them what the harms and adverse consequences are that potentially from them consuming that substance. That's the best interaction we can have with them. We can have all the arguments in the world about the purity and the quality of our equipment to test, but it comes down to talking with that person, and that's going to have a huge impact on their drug use. And that's what we know from experience, and from the academic research will tell you that has a huge impact on their drug use and on the level of harms they're going to experience. And I have a huge debate every week as President of Harm Reduction Australia with Drug Free Australia, our counter opposite. They're the opposite of what we are. Drug Free Australia often, and what I always confront them with is saying their goal is to prevent people using drugs. Because drugs are harmful, prevent their use. And I say to them, how are you going to do that? What actually is your program to stop everybody using a currently illicit substance? And they don't have one. We don't have one. People take risks. People will make decisions that are not in their best interest. We all do at times. Everybody does it. So we have to live in a world that's pragmatic and realistic about people taking risks, and develop public health programs that are able to respond to that. Doesn't mean you don't have prevention education. We agree with that as well. But that can't be your only answer to this. And finally, just on the political point of view, that may be true about what you're saying, but same-sex marriage, there's not a political party, it's people advocating for change, and there were changes made about the superannuation, which you may call backdoor changes to those sorts of things, and in the end, laws change. Laws are not set in stone. They're not tablets handed down by God about you can't change these. These are the commandments. Women couldn't vote. It probably used to be wrong to ride a donkey up the right-hand side of George Street. They're all laws that are stupid and that need to be changed. And drug laws are some of those laws that need to be changed.
Again, that's the point I was making. They can be changed, but they've not been. And I wonder how a plebiscite would go on the legalisation of drugs. What was your initial question? Sorry.
No, it was yeah.
It was mainly. I did ask what the effect would be about drugs being illegal. The effect would be in terms of giving mileage to criminal syndicates.
And I caught 5 lots of burglars red-handed. That's very rare for a policeman. They reckon you get 1 lot in 30 years. I got 5 in 10. I'd never met a burglar that wasn't a heroin addict. Never met a burglar that wasn't a heroin addict. They were all heroin addicts. So I think this myth of people that I accept if people are smoking cannabis, they may be merely consumers of drugs. Actually, the stats would show you that there's not many people in prison merely for consumption, personal use of cannabis. That just doesn't happen. The vast majority of people that get custodial sentences are involved in supply of drugs far more potent than cannabis, although cannabis is not safe. I've known many young men to end up psychotic as a result of taking cannabis and nothing else. I knew I was their local copper, I'd have known if they were doing anything else. It was my business. And so I just don't accept that there's all these kind of, do you know what, even if there was 100,000 consumers of drugs in this country, that doesn't make it right. There's millions of people in this country who don't take drugs. So my contention is, those millions of tax-paying citizens, residents of this country should never ever be asked to offset the costs of somebody who would take a substance that's illegal, and if you don't want it to be illegal, then you need to get this through Parliament to change the law, that's illegal, and also that leads to greater burdens on the taxpayer in terms of healthcare, crime investigations and the like. I should let Gino come back on that if he wants to.
The only point I'll make in that is that I agree in a way, if we could fund it, self-fund it, I'd prefer not to take any government money. I run with another organisation about justice reinvestment, about diverting people from prison in Aboriginal communities. We run on philanthropic money from private foundations, and we choose to run it that way because we actually don't want government involvement and the strings that comes with government money. And we're working on models where people can pay. The reality is today, if I wanted to test my drug I was using a pill, I couldn't even pay for it to get it done. I can't get it done. It's not a matter of payment, it's illegal to get it done.
Just very quickly. Number one, we're actually a generation that consumes the least amount of alcohol since the 1960s, and that's happened across the Western world, despite the fact that alcohol regulations have overall not significantly de-liberalized. They've actually liberalized. That's one thing. The second thing is anecdote again, but in Amsterdam, most of the uses of cannabis, for example, even though it's very permissible, are foreigners. The locals see it as this sort of like thing that foreigners do. They get stoned in Amsterdam. It's a bit daggy. When Colorado legalized cannabis, the rates of use actually went down very slightly. It didn't actually encourage massive uptake. Anyway, questions? Emily.
I did want to ask, say this pill testing debate topic was changed, but it was saying that it was not taxpayers' money anymore, it really was the drug users' money paying for their own individual pill to be tested. I know that would make it a little more agreeable and maybe a little less controversial, but I guess I wanted to ask is, do you think that a drug user is actually going to want to pay and elect to pay at a festival for their own pill? They've already paid $40-50 to be tested, and as is, they've probably paid that $40 to try and go without drinking so they can save a little money. Are they going to want to pay $20-30-40 for a pill test to find out if it's able to be taken? And if it isn't able to be taken, do you actually think they would throw it away? Because I'm pretty confident if they've paid $40 and then $30 for a test, they are taking it even if it's meth, heroin, no matter what it is.
We wouldn't charge that much for a staff, but the models we're working on, we wouldn't take cash on the day either. It wouldn't work that way, and people are prepared to pay. I mean, what you're talking about there is people pay $5 or $4, $3, whatever it is, between taking a substance that may well lead to an overdose and a fatality or not. Yeah, people do it. People used to say to us when we started needle exchanges, people won't come in because they're injectors, they're chaotic guys, they won't talk to you. That's not true. They wanted to protect their health. Just because they use drugs doesn't mean that they somehow throw all reason and rationality out the window and they don't even care about their health at all. That's just not true. You may be able to find a person here or there that may apply to, but the overwhelming majority of people want to protect their health even though they're using drugs.
What I'm going to say is if we start having public policy that applies those principles to testing, then in fact what we're doing is we are encouraging people to take risks who are already more likely to take risks. So I'm not sure what the ethical premise for that is. I think it's the same reason that many young men die on our roads who have red P plates on their cars. This was a new thing for me, being Englishman. We don't have this thing, you pass your test and that's it, you throw your L plates away. But I've buried lots of young people who've died with P plates on their cars. I've buried lots of young people who've taken drugs. I've buried lots of young people who've committed suicide, many of whom have a connection to taking drugs prior to them committing suicide. Those deaths would never be associated with drug use. They would be called suicide. They hang themselves. They gas themselves in their cars. But they are drug related. And so I just don't buy this principle that somehow says, actually, if we're going to have this pill testing, which on the face of it makes it slightly more safe for young adults to take drugs, that it's going to lead to less risk taking. I think it's going to lead to more. And it's a very harsh thing for someone like me to say, but what I said in my statement I hold to. People make a choice. They're free to make that choice. I believe in their freedom to make that choice. People are free to break the law. People are free to take risks with their own lives, not with other people's lives, but with their own lives. And if they take that risk, that can include death, and it does.
I agree. So if they're free to make that choice, aren't they free to have information to inform that choice?
They've already got it.
They don't have it. They don't know what it is they're going to put in their mouth. So don't they have a right to that information?
But again, I mean, to revisit some arguments, they don't know exactly what they're putting in their mouth. They know something that's been detected in some part of the thing that they're going to put in their mouth. So, I mean, it's a flawed principle. You know, and I think to give people individual sovereignty, they have to take their own choice. And so yes, if the testing was entirely devoid of taxpayers' funds, that would allay one of my fears. And I think it must be. You can't expect taxpayers to pay for something they don't want to pay for. Mind you, we'd have to close down a lot of government departments if that was the case. But yeah, I don't buy that it leads to less risk. I think it increases the risk. The question at the back.
So just a few things about the whole pill testing debate. My personal opinion, which I'll talk about later, is I can't understand that we're pretending that the government's perfect with their taxes and their financial sort of stance, in the sense that one $50,000 machine and hiring a few people would be detrimental to the taxpayer, in a sense. That I sort of see that as the main sort of argument against testing a substance, which I don't really understand. But one of my main arguments is, believe it or not, you can go a 15-minute ride on the metro to Chatswood to walk into a CTC tobacconist and buy testing kits on the purity of MDMA, the substance of MDMA, ketamine, cocaine purity, and all of these things, and they're about $28 a pop. And just the sense that the whole argument against pill testing is that should be totally criminal and totally unattainable for a person. Like, I don't understand why someone even trying to figure out what the substance is should be so bad. And just another thing, MDMA as a substance in itself isn't as dangerous as many people get pushed to believe, and by social, and at the end of the day, the whole legality of an item is just a social sort of understanding and construct. Alcohol is a lot more detrimental than marijuana in the sense of liver damage and all those things, but that's another topic. But MDMA therapy is a thing, and it does work. It works on the sense of breaking down empathy in people with PTSD, mainly people who've been at war and people who've lost family members, mass murders, whatever. They go through a 4-week program, and then each week they get a dummy sample of MDMA, and then through one of those weeks they do get a controlled amount. And I don't want to ramble on too much, but the suggested dosage is 1.5 times your actual weight. So if I weigh 100 kilos, the maximum suggested dosage is 150 milligrams. If you lower that to about 80 milligrams, you then sort of unlock, well, not unlock, but you sort of take the empathetic and the emotional side out of that controlled substance. And there is benefits to a lot of substances. So just to see that the only reason why people can't go to a festival, that I have attended the festival where 2 people did pass away, people can't go to a festival and even have the opportunity to understand what they're taking, and the only stance against that is solely taxpayers' money, and there's a social construct of drugs are bad is what I'm trying to sort of figure out.
I think that was for me. I mean, as I said in my address, they were not the only issues that I raised. I think to address your first point about why am I concerned about taxpayers' money, when we all know that taxpayers' money's pissed up the wall left, right and centre by the multiple governments you have available to you in Australia. Well, I think, the argument I made earlier was, or the parallel I drew was in America, where their stated case that went through the Supreme Court said that no taxpayers' dollars should pay for abortion. Now that's not because of the cost of it relative to other things, it's because many people believe it's immoral and unethical, and so now we don't need to debate that about drugs. Drugs are illegal, and they've been made illegal for all sorts of reasons, some good, some bad, some indifferent. But the bottom line is to expect taxpayers who already have to fund the effects of drugs in lots of other ways, in terms of enforcement, healthcare, to actually pay for somebody going to a music festival to test if their drug is what they think it is. I think that's a step too far. Now, I don't object to the first thing, to the other thing you said. If people want to go and pay with their own private money to buy a testing kit, no problem. I haven't got a problem with that. I think that's that's a different argument. So I accept that. Now, what was the last thing that you said about the use of MDMA for medical purposes? Not the argument that we're having today. No, opioids are prescribed by doctors. Medical experts are allowed. In fact, they're not allowed to prescribe enough drugs, in my opinion. What they call the agency, the Therapeutic Goods Agency, the TGA, dreadful organisation. Now, there's many drugs on the market that they don't license, they don't authorise, they don't allow doctors to use. Amongst it, for many years, was medical cannabis, of course. So, yeah, I've got no problem with the therapeutic use of any drug. I said in my address, drugs are not good or bad. Or by their very nature, they're neither of those things. They're a substance to be used, and they should be used in a way that can't cause abuse. But none of this convinces me that I should help some 19-year-old that wants to take ecstasy to get it tested on their way into a festival. By the time they've got there, they've jumped over so many hurdles that have been put in the way. Social pressure, family expectation, school education, healthcare experts, all the rest of it, that really, what's the point? It's an arbitrary use, and it can do nothing but affirm the use of drugs, which can kill people on their first use, unlike alcohol, unlike obesity, unlike tobacco. Can kill people on their first use, and that's overwhelmingly the only reason to prohibit a substance for public consumption is if it's going to kill them. For the same reason you can't buy arsenic down the shop. But 80 years ago you could.
We have legal advice that it's not actually in breach of the Drug Misuse and Trafficking Act in New South Wales or the ACT or any other government. And the forensic toxicologists we use actually have licence to carry up to a certain amount of illicit substances, and the amount we sample is well below that threshold. So we have legal advice that we are not in breach of any Drug Misuse and Trafficking Act.
I don't question the statute law of that about it. And the government are entitled to grant licences and all those sorts of things. Postmen are not illegally in possession if they don't know what it is. There's all sorts of exemptions to that. But we are morally and ethically allowing somebody or putting somebody in possession of an illegal drug. Now, the way that drugs legislation has been enacted in the UK and in Australia, anybody can legally take possession of drugs if what they're going to do with it is throw it down the toilet and flush it, or dispose of it. That is a legal way to possess drugs. But that's not what happens in pill testing. In pill testing, you take the pill, you shave a bit off, you test that bit, you say what's in it, you give it back. It's different.
Chris, I just want to point out what I think is a flaw in your argument. So you've said that people should be free to make their own decisions, including breaking the law. And you've said that they can get information on those decisions, they get that in school. So it seems to me that what the pill testing kit is doing is it's giving more information. Now, you've pointed out that information is complete. Gino agrees with you. But the information is very clear in that it says not complete. It says that it doesn't tell you everything. So yeah, but here's the thing, right? So why, Gino's pointed out that this can be funded completely privately. So assuming that he's right on that, why would you still want to ban people from getting a bit of extra information and then being responsible for their own decisions from that point with that incomplete information?
Sure, well, I don't think you can glide over the issue of saying, oh, well, it's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. I just don't think you can. The main argument is that pill testing doesn't test the entire pill. It doesn't test every substance that's in there. In order to do that, you'd have to take it to a laboratory, put it through. It does tell you that, and therefore, what's the value of it? The implication, which is why it's appealing to people, otherwise people would just walk past the tent and laugh at them as a bunch of do-gooders. As good as a bunch of priests stood in the field saying, please don't do drugs, it's not very good for you. No, people are using the facility because there is an obvious implication that it's safer to have gone through that pill testing scenario, and actually the technology isn't there to tell them that. And effectively, we're encouraging people to break the law. Those laws exist for a reason. They're because the community have wanted them to be against the law. If they didn't, they should go to the polls, come up with a policy, call for a plebiscite, and see if the majority of Australian people want to decriminalise or legalise those drugs. I think that might be a better solution, but you've got to have a mandate to do so. I don't believe there's a mandate to allow pill testing. And if we are giving the people, as we have to, that free choice to take those drugs back and to take them, how will it save any more lives? People are still free to take that red-tested pill and to kill themselves. That's my objection.
Any more audience? Michael Canaris.
Sorry, I came rather late to this, so I'd like to see if this encapsulates the disagreement between you. On the one hand, I gather that prescriptions and legal guidelines about what substances are allowed and prohibited have a normative function. So where the authorities declare this is what we believe should be discouraged. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I gather there is a pragmatic argument that the provision of information would minimise the detriment that occurs from going against those prescriptions. Now, what I would like to work out is, A, would that be fair with both your positions? And B, could there be a danger in taking the latter approach, whereby in effect the authorities have a mixed message going out to the consumers, whereby on the one hand we say this is not allowed, and on the other hand we say but given the circumstances this isn't the absolute worst.
I think both speakers sort of touched on that, but any more thoughts to add?
Michael, that's true. That's what the difference is. But what I said earlier, and you may not have heard, is that what we operate in is in the real world and a pragmatic approach to that. life isn't that simple, and governing countries is not that simple where it's black and white, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, and there's no grey area. Life is full of grey areas, and what we do is we operate in those grey areas where people know it's wrong, people know it's illegal, but they choose to do it anyway. So what do? Do you just throw them out and say, well, bad luck, you made that choice, you're not entitled to any information or any knowledge or anyone helping you or assisting you because you've gone outside the letter of the law? Our answer to that is no. No, that they're operating in that grey area, and we should interact with them, we should communicate and be part of what they're doing. That's what we want to do. And we're not making a moral judgment about whether they should have used that drug or not. We don't actually make moral judgments.
Well, I think I can agree with some of that. I mean, I'm not making a moral judgment on drug users, really. Like I say, that's not the aim of what I'm saying. I think it's also true to say that police officers, prison officers, social workers all work in that grey area. Not everybody who I found in possession of illegal drugs got arrested. That's just a fact. In Britain, that's not unusual. We're given that discretion. We have to throw it away or account for it, put it in the drugstore, and the checks and balances are unbelievable and should be on people that take possession of drugs for lawful purposes. That's one of my concerns with the pill testing debate. But to go back, Michael, and welcome, good to see you here. Michael and I are often on Facebook together, not always agreeing, has to be said. To go back to this, the normative, and I understand what you're saying. I don't think that laws exist merely to set a principle. I think that's what sermons do. Because if you drew a comparison with taxation, if we viewed taxation as just a normative kind of indication that the government would rather like people that earn this amount of money to give this amount for taxation, but if you don't, well, there's a grey area. As we know, and many of us are more libertarian-minded have issues with taxation, we know that if we don't pay the tax that we have to pay, eventually somebody comes along with a gun and a pair of handcuffs and takes us in and shakes us out until we pay it or we go to jail. And so I think that's why drugs are enforced the way they are as well. I mean, these are not guidelines; these are laws, and they're laws because they've gone through the democratic process. We may disagree. I disagree with many laws. We've got far too many bloody laws. When I was a policeman, I first joined. I suffered under the Blair government, and every week there was a new law. Every week there was a new law. We used to say that's a ridiculous law, it's totally unenforceable. They've created a law for the sake of the media. Something's happened, we'll have a law. Someone's died, let's make a law. Someone's died, let's make a policy. And I think that's my objection, is it's this creeping bureaucracy that goes with it. And I'll reiterate again, I don't believe there's a single person going to a music festival, which is what we're talking about, pill testing. There's not a single person going there that doesn't know the health risks and the information. We have been bored senseless with it. In fact, that's one of the problems. We've actually been desensitized by constant nagging of healthcare, nannies wanting to tell us what we should and shouldn't do. And I don't believe having one last line of a nanny in the way between you and the festival site is going to make any difference at all.
I don't think I've heard us pill testing referred to as a part of the nanny state. I mean, what we're trying to do. I think we're the opposite of that. I think what we're doing is accepting that people will make decisions and just helping make a better informed decision. And I will take issue about everybody knows. Chris, I've been in the tent twice now where we actually ran the service here. And in Canberra, which is probably the highest, the population has the highest rates of education, highest socio-economic status probably in the country would be in Canberra. You'd be surprised at how many young people come through and don't have any idea of what they're going to. And what you have to realise is we often have groups of people come in. So not the individual, there'll be a group of 4 or 5. And what you can spot, and what we're able to spot because of our experience and expertise, is there's often 1 or 2 there who don't want to take the drug and are looking for a reason not to take it in front of their friends. And often we're the reason, we give them the reason not to take it, because they actually don't want to do it. You can see it in their eyes, they don't want to do it, but their mates are saying to them, come on, you're part of us, you've got to do this. We give them information, start talking about all the potential adverse outcomes, and what we know is we're legitimising them saying, actually, I'm not going to do that. It actually, and that's what is going to come out. We've had an independent evaluation waiting for the Australian National University to come out. They're in the tent with us, talking to people, following up with them, the ones that gave email addresses and contact details. They've followed up with them. Their report will come out soon. But we know we had an impact and an opportunity for those people to say no. You know, and I don't think you can assume that level of knowledge that everybody has about drugs. Of those 20,000 people that are there, they all know about drugs and what the consequences are.
I accept that, and I do think that a great way to deal with peer pressure is to have an excuse to say no. But let's be honest, by far and away, the strongest reason that people say no is because they might get arrested and convicted, which is why most young people do not take MDMA. Most young people aren't taking these risks with their lives, and so, you know, what we're dealing with is a very small percentage of a very small percentage. A very small percentage of young adults want to take MDMA and go to music festivals, and then of them that choose to do that, a very small percentage will bother to go to a pill testing tent. So, you know, I just think compared to the deterrent effect of being found in possession of drugs, never being able to go to the United States of America, or many other countries that won't have anybody in that category, there are always going to be a small percentage of people that won't listen to anybody. That's why people try to smuggle drugs out of countries where they have the death penalty, and we saw that a few years ago, Australians being shot because they tried to smuggle drugs out. There are always people that are willing to risk their lives. That's not a good reason to have a policy. And there's a maxim in law, sad cases make bad law. And what happens is these young people die at rock festivals or music festivals, and the families say, this is going to mean something, it's going to count for something, and I understand it. It's why we've got multiple charities named after people instead of them actually gathering together and pooling their resources and doing it together. It's because I understand that drive. I'm a father. My sister died because a heroin addict murdered her. You know, I understand the drive for people to want to do that. But the sad, even sadder truth is that really they died for nothing. They died because they made a bad decision. And I don't think softening that pill, to use an unfortunate phrase in this circumstance, I don't think softening that pill does anybody any service. You know, one of those young 17-year-old boy who I buried, his coffin was in my church, and his young mate came up, and I'm a total tyrant in my church. At funerals I allow one eulogy and I want to read it before it's read. Now that's actually because I care about people. I don't want people to feel like everyone's got to say something. We don't want people to be stuck in the church for an hour because people keep talking. That's what wakes are for. Go and have a good time and talk there. But at this one, his best mate never engaged with me. And I'd spoken to his family and got their okay to do what I'm going to tell you I did. Because his friends that did agree the eulogy with me came and read the eulogy. And his mate that was distraught, he's only a young kid, he was at school, 17 years old, 16, came and stood behind them and he was upset. And when they'd finished the eulogy, he said, and you're not really dead, you've just gone fishing. Now we can all identify with the pain and angst that was in that young man in saying that. But I got up in my pulpit afterwards and I said, I'm sorry son, he is dead and he's in this box. Because we have to face very difficult realities when it comes to life and death. And actually it's far more impactful if you want to deter young people from taking that risk to say this person died for no good reason. Do you want to be someone who dies for no good reason and leave your family grieving and your communities? Now I was harsh in saying that. I agreed it with his parents and I agreed it with his school because he was the fourth in his year who had committed suicide in 3 months, and it had to stop. And platitudes and mitigation and all those difficult, you know, well-meaning, well-intentioned ways of being didn't stop it. But after that funeral, there were no more suicides. confronting death, as painful as it is, more often than not, in terms of deterrence, where young people have taken their lives or taken a risk that's ended their life, it's far kinder in the long run to say, no, this is a stupid death, and don't copy it, and don't take the risk. And anything that mitigates that risk is drawing people back from that reality, giving them a false anesthetic that tells them they don't have to face up to that. I think that is far more impactful than an arbitrary test.
Unsurprisingly, I think you're making a sad mistake, Chris, because when you write about sad laws can make bad law, I'm aware of that maxim, but also taking a personal experience and generalising that out to being able to define public policy is something that also is not something we would support. Only for the reasons, not in any way questioning your intentions and your motivations, but we have told young people countless times about the dangers of drugs. And the best example I give is tobacco. No one can actually claim they haven't seen an anti-smoking ad or seen or unaware of any information about tobacco. But we still have 14, 15, whatever it is, % of adult daily smokers in the country because people choose to do it. And you have the doctors confront them, you can have their family confront them, and people still do it. So we don't have an answer to make it 100%. And because we can't make it 100% prevention, we operate, as I say, in that grey area, and it may well be 2%, it may be 8%, it may be 12%, I don't know. But we're going to operate for that percentage of people because they're worthwhile. And what we know with drug use in particular is that people go through a phase. People go through drug use where they use drugs and then, be it a job, a baby, marriage, whatever it can be, travel, all that intervenes and people gradually move away from drugs. I work in the drug and alcohol treatment centre services for a number of years, still do occasional work in there. Most people stop using drugs without any professional intervention. That's the reality. So people go through a phase, and what we're saying is if they're in that phase, they're at a festival, whatever it be, or they're just in a milieu of people, acquaintances that use drugs, they won't be there forever, and we're going to make sure they come out the other side alive, without HIV, without a whole range of other diseases, and a criminal record. We want to see them come out the other side and go on to lead the productive life they want to lead. That's how we operate.
Great. Thanks for that, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Now, the question's up to you. Make up your own minds. Hopefully, at the very least, everyone here has had something to think about and understand the other side on this. And not just going off the comments of people with their family pet as a profile picture on Facebook. So, thanks for that, guys. Thanks for coming out.